Is there a God? Or lots of gods? Or is the notion of a creator a complete delusion? How can we prove God's existence? Or disprove it? These are questions that human beings have been asking and arguing over for centuries. And if you're a student of religious studies or philosophy, it's a question that you're going to have to start pondering too. In this series, we're going to discuss three arguments for the existence of God: the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the ontological argument. But before we get onto those, we've got to get two really essential pieces of terminology under our belts. So that's what we're going to focus on in this video. Now, the terms that we're going to discuss in this video might seem really tricky at first, but please bear with me. I promise it will get easier when we start to look at some examples. So, let's get started. An argument, and we're talking about any argument here, not just arguments for the existence of God, will be either inductive or deductive. It will fall into one of these two categories. Again, don't panic. I'm going to explain what these words mean, starting with inductive. An inductive argument is an argument which uses empirical evidence to come to a conclusion. Empirical evidence is evidence that we can perceive using our senses. So, that which we can see, smell, taste, hear, and touch. To put it another way, inductive arguments use observations to prove their points. To use a silly example of an inductive argument, let's imagine that you're having a disagreement with your brother. He says that the neighbour's dog is a golden retriever, but you claim that it's a bulldog. Now, the only way to discover who's right and who's wrong is to go over to your neighbour's house and look at the dog. In other words, you have to observe the empirical evidence to prove your point. So, although this is clearly a silly example, it underlines the point that inductive arguments use observations and empirical evidence to come to a conclusion. It's for this reason that the act of making observations and finding empirical evidence is called inductive reasoning. So, here we are again. Inductive arguments use empirical evidence to form their conclusions. And it's that phrase, empirical evidence, that's really, really key here. Now, let's move on to deductive arguments. So, in contrast to inductive arguments, deductive arguments do not use empirical evidence to form their conclusions. Instead, a deductive argument is an argument which uses logic to move from a series of premises to an indisputable conclusion. Now, that probably sounds like nonsense right about now, but please don't panic. I promise that it will make sense in a few moments. The best way to explain this concept is probably to begin with an example right away. So here we are, an example of a deductive argument. As you can see, the argument consists of two premises and a conclusion. A premise is just a statement or a claim. So the first premise is that all of the students in Mrs. Sullivan's class study biology. The second premise is that Lily is a student in Mrs. Sullivan's class. And from these two premises, we can conclude that Lily studies biology. So, if you remember our definition of a deductive argument, it's an argument which uses logic to move from a series of premises to an indisputable conclusion. We can see that that's exactly what's happening here. The conclusion follows logically from the two premises that come before it. Deductive arguments like this rely entirely on logic. I don't need to go into Mrs. Sullivan's class and empirically observe that Lily is there in order to accept the conclusion. If I accept that the two premises are correct, then I don't need empirical evidence to believe the conclusion. The conclusion is just simply obvious. One of the essential aspects of a deductive argument is that if you accept that all of the premises are true, then the argument's conclusion is logically obvious and indisputable. It's impossible to contest it. So, returning to our example, if we accept that it's true that all of the students in Mrs. Sullivan's class study biology, and we agree that Lily is a student in Mrs. Sullivan's class, then it is impossible to take issue with this conclusion. The conclusion is logically obvious. It's impossible to accept these premises and then reject this conclusion. To do so would be complete nonsense. It wouldn't make any sense at all. However, it is possible to reject one or both of the premises in a deductive argument. Importantly, if you reject one of the premises, then the argument's conclusion is no longer valid. So let's explain this further by returning to our example. If I refuse to accept either premise 1 or premise 2 here, then the argument's conclusion collapses. So if I dispute premise 2 and argue that Lily is actually not a student in Mrs. Sullivan's class, then the entire conclusion falls apart. It is no longer logically obvious that Lily studies biology. Now, I understand that that was a lot of information, so let's look at another example and then we'll recap a little. So once again, we can see that there are two premises and a conclusion. The first premise is that all mammals have kidneys. The second premise is that cows are mammals. And the conclusion, therefore, is that cows have kidneys. Just as before, if we accept that both of these premises are true, then it's impossible to reject the conclusion. You cannot claim that cows don't have kidneys if you accept that these two premises are correct. The conclusion is logically obvious. Moreover, if you accept both premises, you don't need to use empirical evidence to accept the conclusion. We don't need to go and dissect a cow and check whether it has kidneys. Instead, the premises prove that the conclusion is true on their own. No empirical evidence is required. However, it is possible to dispute the premises. You'd be wrong, of course, if you said that a cow was not a mammal, but that premise in isolation, on its own, is not logically obvious. It is possible to dispute it, and if you do dispute it, then the conclusion is no longer valid. So, you might now be thinking, what does all this have to do with the existence of God? Well, arguments for the existence of God will be either inductive or deductive, and it's useful to have these key terms under your belt before we look at these arguments, as it's important to be aware of how an argument is constructed before you endeavour to support or challenge it. So, inductive arguments for the existence of God will use empirical evidence to try to prove that God exists. These arguments draw from observations of the world, that which we can see, smell, hear, taste and touch, to prove that God exists. Meanwhile, deductive arguments use logic to prove the existence of God. They lay out a series of premises which, provided that we accept them, make it impossible to deny the conclusion that God exists. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be looking at 3 arguments for the existence of God in this series. 2 of these will be inductive, the cosmological argument and the teleological argument, and then we'll look at 1 deductive argument, which is known as the ontological argument. But before we get onto that, we'll be considering 2 more essential terms in next week's video, a priori versus a posteriori. So thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you then.